Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at something a little different.
Yeah.
And
Very, very basic.
yeah, so one of our listeners sent in an episode of a podcast.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's called English Made Easy, Learn the Basics. And this is like episode 1, right?
Like the very, very beginning.
The very beginning.
I
So
love that.
yeah, so we thought, it'd be fun to kind of look at this and see
Sort of a deep dive into.
yeah, a deep dive into the very basics of English.
Yeah.
And kind of talk about, what are some of the core components of language and how are those presented, to a beginner, right? Someone who's just starting out. So
Right. Yeah, because like everybody who speaks a language, started at some point not knowing it.
right.
So it's a good thing to like revisit that and think about.
Yeah, and like this whole podcast, it's based on the idea that English is this, huge global language and it's spoken by millions and millions of people and that it's super important in like business and travel and education.
It is.
And
Yeah, it's kind of like I don't want to say it's the default, but it's often like a lingua franca around the world
yeah,
where even if people don't speak each other's native languages,
right.
often they'll use English to communicate.
Right. And so, the podcast is like, well, hey, if you want to travel or advance in your career, if you want to get a better job or further your education.
Studied abroad or something.
Yeah, then English can really open doors for you.
Absolutely.
So, it frames it in a way that's like, hey, this is super valuable for you.
Yeah. And it's true.
Yeah.
Like if you think about how many people in the world speak English,
Right.
it really does open a lot of doors in terms of communication.
Yeah. So the first question, I guess, is, where do you even begin with a new language,
Yeah.
right? And this podcast says, like, okay, well, the first thing you got to learn are greetings and introductions.
Yeah,
Seems pretty basic.
it does.
Yeah.
It does. And it is basic, but it's also like so important,
Mhm.
Like that's how you start any interaction with another human being
Right.
is just acknowledging them and saying hello.
Right. Right. So the podcast starts out with, hello,
Right.
as like a very basic greeting that you can use anytime.
Right. Just kind of
Yeah.
like your standard.
Yeah. And then it says, okay, hi
Yeah.
is a more casual way to say hello.
Right. So like hello might be what you use with like your boss or
Right.
teacher.
Right.
Whereas hi, you might use with like your friends.
Right. Right. Okay. So it moves on. Then it says, well, there's also time-specific greetings.
Yeah.
Right. So
Which can be tricky.
yeah, like good morning
Right.
for the morning, obviously.
Right. And that's kind of interesting because like when does morning end? Right.
Right. Right.
Like, is it 11:59? Is it noon?
Nobody really knows.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have good afternoon
Right.
for, from noon until evening. And
From noon till like 6 or something?
yeah. Yeah. And then you have good evening when it starts getting dark. And then finally good night for when you're, leaving for the day or going to sleep.
Yeah,
So you've got a lot of options for how to greet someone,
you do.
depending on, the formality and the time of day and everything.
In the context of the situation, yeah.
Right, right. And then after you greet someone, then you have to introduce yourself, right?
Yeah.
So it gives 2 ways to do that. It says you can say, my name is your name. And
Classic.
yeah, the classic introduction.
Yeah.
And then it also says you can say, I'm your name.
Right, which is a little bit shorter.
Right, right. So it gives an example for each of those. It says, hello, my name is Sarah. And then, hi, I'm John.
Nice to meet you, John.
Yeah. So, I mean, those are pretty basic, but like,
They are,
yeah.
but you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. So, if you think about yourself, the listener, right? And you're in a situation where you're meeting someone for the first time, like, which of those would you use?
Right, or if you're like in a different country, right, and you don't speak the language,
Yeah,
but you want to like try to communicate,
yeah.
you know.
That's a great point. Yeah,
So
Mhm.
even just knowing those very basic things can be helpful.
absolutely. So after greetings and introductions, the podcast moves on to the alphabet.
Yeah.
And it says, the English alphabet has 26 letters.
Which is a lot.
It is a lot, yeah, and each letter has its own sound.
Right.
Like,
Although sometimes letters can have more than one sound.
right, which I'm sure we'll get to later. But
We will.
this episode just focuses on the vowels and the, like, main sounds that they make.
Right.
So it starts with A.
Right.
And it says, A is pronounced like A as in cake.
Right. So that's the long A sound.
Yeah, the long A sound, right.
Yeah.
Okay, and then it moves on to E.
Yeah.
And that one is pronounced E as in C.
Right. So those are both cases where like the letter is making the sound of its name.
Like you would say the letter A, and it sounds like A.
Right.
and you would say the letter E, and it sounds like E.
That's true. Yeah.
So that can be helpful for people who are just starting out.
Yeah. Okay. So next up is I,
Right.
which is pronounced A as in kite.
Right.
And then there's O,
Yeah.
which is pronounced O as in go.
Right. That's another one where it kind of says its name.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh. Ooh. Ooh.
And then finally, E is pronounced U as in tube.
Right. And that one's a little trickier
Yeah.
because it doesn't quite say its name,
Right.
but it's close.
It's close. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is just like a very, very basic introduction to the vowel sounds.
Yeah.
It's not exhaustive, obviously.
No, they're going to do more episodes
Right.
about like pronunciation.
Yes. So then the last part of this episode is some common phrases for beginners.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So these are like, things that you can say to someone to start a conversation. Right. Or to ask them a question.
Right. Or just to be polite.
Yeah. Yeah. So it starts with how are you?
Right. The classic.
The classic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it says that this is how you ask someone how they're feeling.
Right. Like, are you happy? Are you sad?
Yeah.
Are you doing okay?
Yeah. And then the typical response that it gives is, I'm fine. Thank you.
Right. Polite and simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the next one is, what's your name?
Right.
Which is, pretty self-explanatory.
Very straightforward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last phrase that it gives is, where are you from?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so this is how you ask someone about their origin.
Right. Like, what country are they from? What city?
Right.
Maybe even what neighborhood they're from.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the podcast actually gives like a little example conversation
Oh, cool.
to show how these phrases all fit together. So it starts with person one saying, hi, what's your name?
Okay.
And then person two says, hello, my name is Maria, and you.
So they return the question. Right.
Which is polite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then person one says, I'm Tom, how are you? Oh, he introduces himself.
Right.
And then asks how the other person's doing.
Right.
And then person two says, I'm good, thank you. How about you?
Right. So again, like
Returning the question.
returning the question, being polite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then person one says, I'm fine, thanks.
Okay.
And that's the end of the conversation.
So very simple.
Very simple. Yeah.
But it gets the point across.
It does, yeah. And so, thinking about you, the listener again.
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine yourself in that situation? Can you picture yourself as Tom or Maria?
Having that conversation.
Yeah.
Like, could you do it?
Right. And I think, like, one of the things that's important for language learning is to actually say the words out loud.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's one thing to, like, read them or hear them.
Right.
But it's another thing to actually produce them with your own mouth.
Right. Right. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I guess, what have we learned? Well, we've learned why English is so important globally.
Yeah.
We've learned some very basic greetings and how to introduce yourself.
Right.
We've learned the sounds of the 5 main vowels.
Yeah.
And we've learned a few key phrases to start basic conversations. And the podcast actually gives a little homework assignment.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it says to practice using these phrases with someone.
Yeah.
Right? Or if you don't have anyone to practice with, you can just practice them by yourself in front of a mirror.
Right. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Just get used to saying the words out loud.
Yeah, and they say practice makes perfect, right?
It's true.
So the more you practice, the better you'll get at it.
Yeah, and the more comfortable you'll feel.
Right, right. And the podcast also says to, keep an ear out for simple words and phrases in English.
Oh, yeah.
So as you're going about your day, just listen for words that you might be able to pick up and remember.
Right. Like if you're watching TV or listening to music,
Yeah.
just kind of pay attention.
Yeah, yeah. And, the podcast also says that if you have any questions, you can reach out to them.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so they're really trying to create this, like, supportive learning environment.
Yeah.
Where, people feel comfortable asking questions and getting help.
Yeah, which is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my final thought for you is, think about a situation that you might encounter today where knowing just these basic phrases could make a difference.
Right.
Right? Like maybe you're at a coffee shop and you want to order something.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're, online and you're chatting with someone from a different country.
Right.
Like, could you use these phrases to communicate?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think even just knowing a few basic phrases can make you feel more confident.
Right.
And more comfortable interacting in English.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope this deep dive has been helpful for you.
Yeah, I hope so too.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See ya.
Bye, man.